Before dawn on April 6, 1862, most of the soldiers camped along the Tennessee River near a small log church called Shiloh believed the war in the West had nearly been won. Within 2 days, more Americans would be killed, wounded, or captured on that ground than in every previous American war combined. Shiloh did not end the Civil War. It ended the idea that the war would end quickly, cheaply, or without a staggering cost in blood on both sides. To understand how the armies arrived at that field, the story begins 6 weeks earlier, in the wreckage of the Confederacy's western defenses. By the middle of February 1862, the Confederacy's hold on the Western Theater was collapsing. In the span of 10 days, Union forces under Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant, working alongside naval gunboats commanded by Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote, had taken Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. Fort Donelson's fall on February 16th was catastrophic for the South. Nearly 13,000 Confederate soldiers were captured. Middle Tennessee lay open to invasion, and Nashville fell within days. The Confederacy's Western commander, General Albert Sidney Johnston, a West Point graduate and one of Jefferson Davis's most trusted officers, found his army split by the Tennessee River and in full retreat. Davis, badly shaken, rushed reinforcements west and sent Johnston a new second-in-command, General P.G.T. Beauregard, the celebrated victor of Fort Sumter and Manassas, who arrived still weakened by a recent throat operation and a chronic fever that would plague him for months. Johnston and Beauregard agreed the scattered Confederate forces had to be concentrated before they could hope to check the Union advance. They chose Corinth, Mississippi, a rail town of barely 1,200 people where 2 vital railroads crossed, the Mobile and Ohio running north-south, and the Memphis and Charleston running east-west, the only all-weather rail link between the Mississippi River and the Atlantic seaboard. Through late March, troops converged there from across the Western Confederacy, arriving by rail and on foot until roughly 45,000 men had gathered. They were organized into a new Army of Mississippi under 4 corps commanders, Leonidas Polk, Braxton Bragg, William Hardee, and John Breckinridge. It was an army short on modern rifles. Fewer than 10,000 rifled muskets were in service. The rest, a patchwork of old smoothbores, shotguns, and squirrel guns, and shorter still on uniforms and discipline. Bragg, a strict disciplinarian, privately called it a mob. Yet morale ran high, and upon these raw regiments now rested the Confederacy's hope of reversing its fortunes in the West. In St. Louis, Major General Henry Halleck had been given command of the entire Western Theater after the twin victories at Henry and Donelson, and he ordered Grant's Army of the Tennessee and Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio to unite for a strike at Corinth. Buell chose to march his 37,000 men overland from Nashville rather than move by river, a decision that cost him weeks when spring floods washed out the bridges over the Duck River. Grant's roughly 48,000 men, meanwhile, encamped on the west bank of the Tennessee River at a steamboat landing called Pittsburgh Landing, a rolling wooded plateau bounded by flooded creeks that offered natural protection on both flanks. It was, on paper, a defensible position. In practice, Grant's arrangement of his 6 divisions was careless. His 2 least experienced divisions, under William Tecumseh Sherman and Benjamin Prentiss, held the exposed forward camps nearest the enemy, while his 3 veteran divisions camped safely to the rear near the landing. No one had ordered field fortifications built. Confidence bordered on complacency. Grant told his wife he wanted to whip these rebels once more in a big fight, and on April 5th assured Halleck he had scarcely any expectation of being attacked, though he would be prepared should one come. He was wrong. On the night of April 2nd, Johnston learned that Buell's army was closing the gap and decided the moment to strike had come. Beauregard drafted the attack order, a plan that arrayed the army in successive lines stretched across the entire front rather than concentrated for a decisive blow on the flank, a structure later criticized as needlessly complicated for so green and inexperienced an army. The march from Corinth, meant to take a single day, instead consumed 3, slowed by rain, ruined roads, and green troops who fired their weapons in the woods to test them despite strict orders for silence. By the evening of April 5th, with his exhausted men finally in position barely a mile from the unsuspecting Union camps, Beauregard urged Johnston to call the attack off, arguing that surprise had surely been lost after several skirmishes with Union pickets. Bragg agreed. Johnston refused. "I would fight them if they were 1,000,000, he told his assembled generals. The assault would go forward at dawn. It began just before 5 in the morning on April 6th, when a Union patrol sent out on Colonel Everett Peabody's own initiative, without orders from his division commander, collided with Confederate skirmishers south of the Union camps. Within the hour, the entire Confederate line was moving forward through the timber, and the Federal camps around a small log Methodist meeting house called Shiloh Church were caught almost completely by surprise. Prentiss's division was overrun within a few hours. Peabody himself, already wounded 4 times, was killed by a shot to the head while trying to rally his broken brigade. Across the field, Sherman was thrown into the fight directly at the moment he realized the enemy was truly upon him, struck in the hand by a bullet that killed his orderly beside him. His division fought stubbornly around Shiloh Church for nearly 3 hours. One Ohio regiment, the 6th Mississippi, lost roughly 70% of its men in a single failed assault. But by mid-morning, Confederate momentum was undeniable. Thousands of Union soldiers were fleeing toward the river, and entire camps, with breakfast still cooking on the fires, fell into Confederate hands. Yet the very success of the Confederate onslaught began to work against it. Soldiers stopped to loot captured tents. Johnston himself scolded one man he found rifling through Prentiss's belongings, then picked up a discarded tin cup and said only, "Let this be my share of the spoils today." More seriously, Beauregard's layered formation had dissolved into confusion within the first hours, with regiments from different corps hopelessly intermingled and a planned sweeping flanking maneuver degenerating instead into a series of costly frontal assaults. On the Union left, Colonel David Stewart's small isolated brigade, guarding a ford over Lick Creek, held off repeated attacks for roughly 2 hours before running low on ammunition and falling back, buying time that Grant's army badly needed to organize a defense closer to the landing. That defense took shape along an old sunken wagon road bordering a dense thicket in the center of the field, held by the divisions of Benjamin Prentiss and William H.L. Wallace, roughly 5,700 infantry backed by 25 guns. The Confederates who attacked that thicket nicknamed it the Hornet's Nest for the sound of bullets tearing through the underbrush. Wave after wave of Southern regiments, under Gibson, Shaver, Anderson, and others, was thrown into the position and thrown back with heavy losses for no ground gained. One wounded Louisiana colonel, shot through both cheeks, reportedly waved his sword and shouted that this was as good a place as any to die. Many of his men did. It was near there, directing an attack against the Union left in the Sarah Bell peach orchard, that General Albert Sidney Johnston was struck behind the knee by a bullet that severed an artery, the wound concealed by his high boot. He bled to death within the hour, apparently unaware how serious the injury was until it was too late for even a simple tourniquet to save him. Command of the Confederate Army passed to Beauregard, who learned of Johnston's death around 3 that afternoon and continued directing the battle from his headquarters near Shiloh Church. By late afternoon, Confederate officers, acting partly on their own initiative, had massed dozens of artillery pieces, traditionally remembered as over 60 guns, though modern estimates put the figure closer to 50, into a single grand battery trained on the Hornet's Nest. This concentrated bombardment, among the heaviest yet seen on any North American battlefield, combined with Union withdrawals on both flanks that exposed Wallace's and Prentiss's men, finally isolated the position. By 5:30 that evening, after nearly 6 hours of resistance, the Hornet's Nest collapsed. General Wallace was mortally wounded trying to escape through the encirclement. Prentiss surrendered with roughly 2,250 men. Even in defeat, Prentiss reportedly told his captors they had taken the bravest brigade in the United States Army. The stand had consumed most of the Confederate Army's afternoon, and with it, most of its remaining momentum. As darkness fell, Beauregard halted the attack along the whole line, confident he could finish off Grant's battered army the next morning. He did not yet know that Buell's Army of the Ohio, roughly 20,000 strong, had reached the landing and was being ferried across the river through the night, joined by a fresh division under Lew Wallace that finally arrived from Crump's Landing after a delayed and roundabout march. All night, Union gunboats on the Tennessee River shelled the Confederate positions at intervals, denying the exhausted Southern soldiers any real rest, while a heavy rainstorm soaked the wounded and the dead alike across the field. When Sherman found Grant standing under a tree that night, smoking a cigar in the rain, he remarked that they'd had the devil's own day. Grant's reply became one of the war's most quoted lines, "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow, though." He did. Before dawn on April 7th, the combined Union armies, now numbering around 45,000, nearly half of them fresh troops who had not fought the day before, advanced across the same ground the Confederates had won a day earlier. Beauregard, with perhaps 28,000 exhausted and badly disorganized men, some of whose corps commanders took hours simply to locate their own scattered units, fought a stubborn defensive battle through the morning and early afternoon, mounting local counterattacks that briefly checked the Union advance in several places, including a determined stand around Water Oaks Pond. But the weight of fresh numbers told. Buell's divisions pushed steadily along the Union left through the old Sarah Bell peach orchard, while on the right, Lew Wallace and the reorganized commands of Sherman and McClernand advanced across Jones Field. By early afternoon, it was clear to Beauregard that his army could not hold, and around 3 o'clock he ordered a general withdrawal, covered by a rear guard under Breckinridge that held the Corinth Road until roughly 5 in the evening. By that hour on April 7th, the Confederate Army was in full retreat toward Corinth, and the Battle of Shiloh, fought also under the name Pittsburgh Landing, was over. A brief skirmish the next day at Fallen Timbers, between Sherman's troops probing the retreat and Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry screening it, closed out the campaign. The second day's fighting had unfolded across the same 3-mile front the Confederates had won the day before, only now the roles were reversed. On the Union left, Brigadier General William Bull Nelson's division led Buell's advance up the Hamburg-Savannah Road, running into Confederate resistance near the Widow Wicker's Field by mid-morning. In the center, the divisions of Thomas Crittenden and Alexander McCook pushed west across Duncan Field and back into the ground of the previous day's Hornets' Nest fighting, this time driving the Confederates before them. On the Union right, Lew Wallace's fresh division and the reorganized remnants of Sherman's command fought their way south across Jones Field against a Confederate defense that grew thinner and more disorganized by the hour, as Beauregard struggled to locate and reassemble corps that had lost virtually all cohesion overnight. One Louisiana soldier, watching the Union lines seem to multiply no matter how many volleys were fired into them, compared the bluecoats to mushrooms sprouting from the earth. A Mississippi private wrote in his diary that he had begun, for the first time, to doubt how the battle would end. Beauregard himself rode near the front for much of the day, at one point reportedly carrying the colors himself under fire, telling aides who objected that the order now had to be follow, not go. It was not enough. By early afternoon, with Union reinforcements pressing every sector of his line, Beauregard recognized that the army he had spent so much of its strength to bring this far could not survive another day of fighting. What Shiloh left behind stunned both sides. The Union suffered over 13,000 casualties, including nearly 1,800 killed. The Confederacy lost close to 10,700, including over 1,700 killed. Combined, the two-day battle produced more casualties than the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican-American War put together. A fact contemporaries found almost impossible to comprehend. In the North, newspapers turned savagely on Grant, blaming him for being caught unprepared in his own camps, and many credited Buell alone with saving the army on the second day. Calls for Grant's dismissal reached the White House. Lincoln refused, reportedly answering critics with the line, "I can't spare this man. He fights." For the Confederacy, Shiloh was an unambiguous disaster. The army that had marched out of Corinth with real hope of reversing the losses at Henry and Donelson limped back into the same town it had left, having failed to destroy Grant's army before Buell could arrive, and having lost, in Albert Sidney Johnston, the General Jefferson Davis considered the finest officer in Confederate service. Johnston's death removed the one Western commander with the stature and experience many believed could have rivaled Robert E. Lee and the Western Confederacy would struggle for the rest of the war to find a general capable of filling that void. Within weeks, the shattered Army of Mississippi was itself under siege at Corinth by the combined forces of Grant, Buell, and John Pope, all now under Halleck's direct command, and by the end of May, the town. The entire object of the Shiloh campaign was in Union hands without another major battle being fought for it. For the men who survived Shiloh, the battle left a different kind of mark. Soldiers on both sides had gone into their first major engagement, expecting something closer to the brief, almost festive skirmishes of the war's opening months. What they found instead were 2 days of continuous fighting across ground made unrecognizable by smoke, fallen timber, and thousands of dead and wounded men and horses, followed by a night of cold rain in which the wounded of both armies lay together in the open, some of them drowning where they had fallen in the sudden downpour. Union burial parties in the days after the battle reported having to dig mass graves simply to keep pace with the dead. Letters home from soldiers who had marched to Pittsburgh Landing expecting an easy campaign described instead a battlefield that had changed their understanding of what this war would require of them. Shiloh did not decide the Civil War, but it changed how both sides understood it. The Battle of Manassas the previous summer had already shattered illusions of a short war. Shiloh went further. It showed, in a single field in Tennessee, what industrial-age armies of tens of thousands of men could do to one another in 2 days of fighting, and it made unmistakably clear that neither side could expect an easy end to the conflict. Many Americans had believed, in the flush of victory after Henry and Donelson, that the beginning of the end was at hand. Shiloh proved instead to be only the end of the beginning.